Horrifying Murder in the U.S. Student kills 5 family members. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Imagine walking through a city where every shadow could hide a story, and every decision you make changes someone's life forever. What would you do if you held that kind of responsibility in your hands? Stick around, because this story will take you deep into the heart of choices, courage, and consequences. And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss a single twist, just hit that subscribe button. It's like staying one step ahead in a city full of surprises. The autumn sun dipped low over Morgan City, Louisiana, casting the Atchafalaya River in deep shades of copper and gold. On most evenings, the docks were filled with chatter vendors calling out prices, children racing along the boardwalk, and the steady hum of boat engines. But in October of 2017, silence fell heavy on one particular stretch of the river. For 3 days straight, the Thompson family's houseboat sat anchored in place, its windows dark and its doors sealed. This was not like Earl and Linda Thompson. Earl was a man who woke before dawn, running the generator so his wife could bake pies for the riverside market. Their children, Jacob, Amy, and little Chloe, were fixtures of the riverfront, known for their bright greetings and ready smiles. To the community, the Thompsons were more than neighbors. They were part of the daily rhythm of life. When 3 mornings passed without the family opening their stall or lighting a lantern, concerns spread quickly. Some thought they might have traveled upriver. Others feared illness. But by the 3rd day, unease turned to dread. Boats gliding past noticed no sound, no laughter, not even the faint hum of Earl's tools. It was as if life aboard had been extinguished. That morning, Harold Jennings, a fisherman and longtime friend, decided he could wait no longer. From his skiff, he called out across the water, "Earl? Linda? Y'all in there?" His voice carried, but the only reply was the slap of water against the hull. Alarm rising, Harold rowed ashore and alerted the sheriff's office. By 9 o'clock, deputies had gathered at the boat under the direction of Captain Marcus Hale. Years of experience told him this was no ordinary welfare check. The door gave way under pressure, the hinges groaning. What met them first was not sight, but smell, a sharp metallic odor that made the men pause. Inside, the houseboat was still and dark, as though frozen in time. And then the truth revealed itself. Linda and Chloe near the galley. Jacob collapsed on his bunk. Earl by the engine, a wrench still in hand. Amy at the bow, her gaze turned toward the open water, as though she had tried to flee. An entire family, gone. Outside, the river kept moving, carrying boats and barges as if nothing had changed. But for Morgan City, that October morning marked the beginning of a story no one would ever forget. Captain Marcus Hale stepped into the Thompson houseboat with deliberate care. Years on the force had taught him to expect the worst, but what lay before him pressed heavy on the chest. He moved slowly, flashlight beams sliding across broken mugs, a kettle overturned, blood mingled with spilled tea. Everyday life cut short, in the most violent way. The deputies spread through the narrow rooms. Jacob's body was twisted across his bunk, suggesting he had been startled awake. At the back, Earl lay near the engine room, his hand locked around a wrench, a father's final act of defiance. Hale lingered a moment, his jaw set tight. He knew Earl to be a steady man, the kind who fought to protect what mattered most. Then Hale saw it. A steel safe in the corner, its door warped and beaten open. Inside lay only scraps of paper and empty envelopes. The money was gone. The neighbors had spoken of Earl's recent sale of equipment and an old motor, cash he meant to put toward a new generator. Someone had known about it, and someone had come to take it. Deputy Claire Boudreau knelt to examine the safe. "This wasn't random," she said quietly. "They came for this." The coroner and forensic team began their work: photographs, measurements, careful notes. Each victim bore the same mark: blunt force trauma to the head, most from behind. The killer had struck quickly and decisively. No time for screams, no chance for escape. Whoever entered that boat came with a plan. and left with blood and money both. Outside, the Atchafalaya kept flowing, indifferent. That indifference made the work harder. Crimes on water were different. On land, investigators could track tire marks, footprints, even cigarette butts. On the river, evidence vanished into the current. Blood diluted, sound carried strangely, and the endless traffic of boats masked any single vessel's passage. A killer could disappear into the night as though swallowed by the tide. Hale stepped onto the deck, scanning the docks now crowded with curious onlookers and reporters. He felt the weight of their stares, the questions forming before a word was asked. How could this happen here? Who would do such a thing? He had no answers, yet only the knowledge that 5 lives were gone, and their killer was still free. Claire joined him, her expression pale but composed. "Captain," she said softly, "this one's going to be rough. We've got no prints, no weapon, and no witnesses willing to say they heard a thing." Hale's gaze stayed fixed on the river, its brown water swirling around the pilings. "He made a mistake somewhere," Hale murmured. "Nobody carries out something like this without leaving a trace. We just haven't found it yet." He thought of Linda's pies, cooling on the dock, of Chloe skipping stones, of Earl bent over an engine block, sweat on his brow. The images came unbidden, sharp as glass. For their sake, he promised himself, the case would not be allowed to drown in the Atchafalaya. Somewhere out there, guilt was eating at the man who had done this. Hale would make sure that guilt led straight back to him. The coroner's report arrived by midday, and it painted the same grim story that Captain Marcus Hale had already begun to piece together. The Thompsons had died in the early hours of the 12th of October, 2017, sometime between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. 5 lives ended in less than an hour, perhaps less than half of one. For 3 long days, their boat had floated silently at the dock, while the marketplace bustled just beyond its walls. Each victim bore the same fatal mark: blows to the head from a heavy object. Earl and Jacob showed faint defensive wounds, signs of a last desperate effort to resist, but the rest had no chance at all. The killer had struck quickly, moving through the boat with ruthless efficiency. It was either the work of a mind coldly prepared, or of someone caught in a spiral of fear and panic. Either way, the result was the same. What unsettled Hale most was the silence. The Thompson boat sat only yards from others, yet no one reported cries for help, no crash of struggle. Fishermen had gone out before dawn, engines growling across the river. But to their ears, nothing seemed unusual. Somehow, the intruder had killed 5 people without raising an alarm. For investigators, the river was no ally. On land, a shoe print or tire track could hold steady for days. Here, water erased everything. Blood slipped away into the current. Objects tossed aside disappeared into the silt. Even sound betrayed them, carrying and echoing until no one could say where it had come from. Hale knew the river had swallowed crimes before, and now it was threatening to swallow this one too. Still, he pressed on. Deputies canvassed houseboats up and down the waterfront, knocking on doors, asking the same questions. More than 200 people were interviewed in the first 2 days. Every answer sounded the same. A normal night, nothing strange. It was as if the killer had stepped onto the water like a shadow and vanished again without a trace. The team also turned to surveillance cameras from bait shops, gas stations, even the shrimp plant downriver. But the lenses showed only distant specks of light boats moving through the fog. You could not tell who they belonged to. Hale stared at the grainy footage until his eyes blurred, seeing nothing that would give him a lead. Meanwhile, the story spread. Reporters gathered at the docks, their voices carrying phrases like brutal slaying and entire family wiped out. On television and social media, rumors multiplied. Gangs, drifters, river pirates. Fear seeped into daily life. Parents kept children indoors after dusk. Vendors closed stalls early. The market, usually full of laughter and song, grew quiet. For Hale, the weight was personal. Each question shouted by a journalist, each glance from a grieving neighbor pressed down on him like a stone. He knew that every day without answers chipped away at trust. An entire parish was waiting for him to deliver justice. Then came a potential break. During one late-night session, a deputy brought up the name Warren Pike. He was another vendor, known for his temper and long-standing feud with Earl Thompson over fruit prices. There had been shouting matches, even threats. Some neighbors remembered Warren swearing that Earl would regret taking his business. On paper, it fit: motive, opportunity, and temperament. For 2 days, deputies tailed him, asked questions, reviewed his record. They even brought him in for an interview. Warren bristled, but didn't falter. His alibi, an overnight delivery logged at a processing plant, held strong. Paperwork, witnesses, timestamps. Hale let the theory go. Rivalry might cause shouting, but this crime spoke of something else. The safe, broken and empty, told the real story. This was about money cash that someone had been desperate enough to kill for. Back at headquarters, Hale pinned photographs to a corkboard. The bent safe, the empty envelopes, the still faces of the Thompsons. He stared at them until the room blurred. "The river hides what it wants to hide," his father used to say. But guilt was heavier than water. Somewhere, the killer carried that weight, and eventually, it would drag him down. Hale was determined to be there when it did. 3 days after the autopsy confirmed the time of death, Captain Marcus Hale sat in his office staring at the caseboard. Photos of the Thompson family and sketches of the crime scene created a grim collage. Red threads connected names, locations, and hypotheses. Yet the board still felt empty, like a safe that refused to open. The traces were too faint. Morgan River had left nothing behind. Then a small detail emerged, changing the direction of the investigation. It came from June Miller, the owner of the gumbo cart usually parked near Riverside Market on evenings. June had served the Thompsons for years and remembered every smile, every favorite dish. But the story she told that afternoon wasn't about Earl or Linda. It was about a boy. June recalled clearly. 2 days after the Thompsons vanished, a young man approached her cart. His face was pale and worn, as if he hadn't slept for days. He ordered a bowl of gumbo, costing $6, but when June mentioned the price, he handed her a crisp $100 bill, freshly withdrawn from a bank. "I found it strange," June told Detective Clare, jotting notes. His hands were shaking. "He almost dropped the money when I gave him the change. He snatched it back, eyes darting around like someone was following him. Captain Hale paid close attention when the report reached him. Fresh bills rarely appeared in Morgan City. A boy trembling handing over a $100 bill for a $6 meal. That didn't make sense. Hale underlined the words in his notebook. Fresh money, fear, youth. The problem wasn't the money. It was the behavior. A professional criminal would know better. They launder stolen money, break it into smaller amounts, hide it carefully. They never hand a $100 bill for a cheap meal and tremble like they were about to collapse. This was different. A young, inexperienced person paralyzed with fear. This line of thinking opened a new investigative path. At the next task force meeting, Hale stood before the board, marker in hand. "We've been tracking this as a professional hit," he said calmly. "But look at the pattern. This isn't skilled. The safe wasn't cracked, it was smashed. Lives endangered recklessly, and now he spends a $100 bill on gumbo as if he doesn't know what else to do with it." The room fell silent. Hale wrote a single word on the board in bold red: fear. "This isn't a seasoned criminal," he continued. "It's a boy, unaware of the weight of his actions. He thinks money can save him, but every dollar he spends is a confession. He'll keep spending in small, safe increments, but each time, his hands will shake. That's how we find him." "Oh?" Detective Clare translated the insight into action. She suggested checking locations frequented by local youth convenience stores, arcades, gaming centers, not vague inquiries, but precise questions. "Has anyone recently come in, paid for a small purchase with a fresh $100 bill, and seemed terrified?" It was a gamble, but better than staring at the empty Morgan River. The team split, spreading across Morgan City and surrounding neighborhoods. They checked food trucks, gas stations, late-night diners. At first, responses were negative. Then, a lead appeared. Ray Duvall, owner of a small arcade with neon lights, remembered something unusual. "A kid came in last week," he leaned on the counter. Thin, exhausted, only bought $10 worth of game time. Paid with a $100 bill, didn't dare look at me. Every time the door opened, he jumped. Hale's pulse quickened as the report reached him. 2 witnesses, 2 fresh $100 bills. two matching accounts of trembling behavior. The picture was forming. Back at headquarters, Hale circled the notes on the board. The suspect wasn't a stranger, a local teenager, collapsing under the weight of a crime. This explained the brutality, the carelessness, the silence afterward, not strength, but fear choking him. Somewhere in Morgan City, a boy carried not only stolen money but memories too heavy to bear from a night that destroyed a family. Hale knew from experience, guilt leaks. It shows in shaking hands, evasive glances, and the smallest choices like paying $6 with $100. The river had erased footprints. But fear? Fear remained, stamped on every bill the boy dared to spend. By the morning of the fourth day, Captain Hale felt the tension in the precinct, like static electricity. Every officer moved with quiet urgency, while the hum of computers tracking leads created a nervous rhythm, yet the boy remained invisible. Detective Claire, analyzing the fresh bill sightings, noticed a subtle pattern. All purchases were small, never exceeding $10, and all locations were within a mile of each other. The boy wasn't trying to leave the city, he was trapped within it. Fear wasn't just an emotion, it had become a prison. Hale entered the room, coffee in hand, studying the map on the wall. Red pins marked sightings, the gumbo cart, the arcade, a convenience store. He traced a line with his finger, noting distances and timing. "Look," he said, pointing. "He's moving predictably, not erratically. Fear is controlling him, but fear has a pattern. Kids don't calculate, they follow comfort zones." Claire nodded. "Then we wait at the next comfort zone. He'll circle back eventually." The team decided to stake out Riverside Market again, where June Miller's gumbo cart gleamed under the morning sun. Claire stationed herself discreetly nearby, camera ready, while Hale stayed in the background, notebook in hand. Hours passed as customers came and went, the city moving on around them. Just as hope began to waver, a figure appeared at the edge of the parking lot, unmistakable. Thin, pale, shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. True to every description, he handed over $100 bill for a small purchase. A bag of chips this time, hands trembling violently. Claire signaled quietly, and Hale watched, heart pounding. Everything matched the profile they had painstakingly built. Age, fear, impulsive spending, predictable locations. When the boy left the cart, Hale motioned for two officers to follow at a safe distance. They tracked him to a narrow alley behind a laundromat where he paused, scanning the street, aware of being followed yet not running. Fear made him cautious but not clever enough to escape. Hale approached slowly. "Hey," he said softly, hands visible. "I am Captain Hale. We don't want to hurt you." The boy froze, then bolted. Claire and the officers called after him, but he disappeared around the corner. Hale clenched his jaw. This wasn't failure. It was part of the process. Fear could guide them to him or make him vanish in seconds. They regrouped, and Claire studied CCTV footage from nearby stores, identifying his exact route. He used alleyways and side streets, keeping to shadows, but always returned near familiar areas. Fear dictated his geography. Later that night, Hale stood over the caseboard, connecting sightings, timestamps, and small purchases. A realization struck him. The boy wasn't just acting out of panic, he was seeking something. Each stop, each small expenditure, was a desperate attempt to normalize the chaos he'd caused. "You're right," Claire said from behind him. "He's repeating a loop. Each action is small, meaningless to anyone else, but it's how he copes with what he's done. And every time, he leaves a trail." Hale nodded. "And that trail is enough for us. It always island." The next day, the team refined their strategy. Officers were stationed discreetly along his known path. Hale coordinated with local businesses, making them aware without alarming the boy. The city became a network of gentle traps, designed to catch him without triggering panic. By evening, the city lights reflected off wet asphalt after a light drizzle. Hale and Claire watched from a distance as the boy appeared again, hesitant, shaking, carrying the same fearful energy that had defined him from the start. This time, he didn't notice the gumbo cart. Instead, he paused at a newsstand, staring at a headline about the Thompson case. Hale whispered to Claire, "They're at Island. Guilt is stronger than fear now. He can't hide from it." Claire nodded silently. The boy looked around, panic building, until he crouched down, clutching his knees, unable to move. It was the moment Hale had anticipated. Fear had guided them here. Guilt had trapped him. Hale stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "You don't have to run anymore. We know what happened. We just want to talk." The boy froze, then slowly raised his head. Tears streaked his face, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and unbearable guilt. Hale allowed a small, reassuring smile. This wasn't the end of the investigation, but it was a turning point. The invisible boy had left footprints, fear-shaped, trembling, imperfect, but enough for justice to find him. And for Hale, that was enough for now. The next morning, the precinct hummed with cautious anticipation. Hale reviewed the latest CCTV footage with Claire, carefully tracing the boys' movements since their last encounter. Each pause, each minor action, seemed like a breadcrumb leading them forward. "He's predictable now," Hale said quietly. "Fear still guides him, but guilt is shaping his path." Claire nodded, eyes scanning the footage for inconsistencies. A slightly open alley door, a stray bicycle, a moved trash can, anything signaling a change. By mid-afternoon, the boy appeared near Riverside Market, shivering in a thin jacket, clutching his backpack tightly. Hale signaled Claire, who radioed the officers stationed discreetly along nearby streets. They blended into the city's ordinary bustle, careful not to startle him. The boy hesitated at intersections, glancing at passers-by with nervous eyes. He was more cautious now, yet drawn to familiar zones. Hale approached slowly, keeping his tone calm. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, voice soft but steady. The boy froze, then bolted down a narrow alley. Officers followed cautiously, maintaining distance so as not to provoke panic. The alley ended behind a small cafe, cornering the boy. He sank to his knees, trembling, eyes wide. Claire knelt beside him, offering a reassuring presence. Hale spoke gently. "We just want to help. You're safe. Nothing you've done can't be addressed." Slowly, the boy lifted his head, tears glistening. The city noise faded around them, leaving only the quiet acknowledgement of a chase that had reached its turning point. Officers moved closer, not to restrain, but to guide. Hale observed silently, feeling a mix of relief and reflection. This wasn't merely a capture, it was a fragile bridge between fear and understanding. The boy, once invisible and unpredictable, now faced the chance to confront his guilt and begin healing. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the wet pavement, Hale realized the boy was no longer running from the city, the officers, or himself. He was standing at the edge of something new, fragile, and real. And sometimes, Hale thought, that was enough. The boy stayed quiet for several moments, still clutching his backpack. Hale crouched slightly, maintaining a respectful distance, while Claire gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "We're not here to punish you," she said softly. "We just want to understand so we can make sure you're safe." The boy blinked, hesitant before whispering, "I didn't mean, I just—" His voice broke, revealing the fear and guilt he had carried alone. Hale nodded slowly. "We know, and it's okay to be scared. What matters is what you do next." He glanced at Claire, who offered a small, encouraging smile. The officers standing nearby remained silent, giving space but ready to assist if needed. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, though tension still lingered. After a long pause, he finally lowered his backpack and let out a shuddering sigh. Hale extended his hand, not to grab, but as a gesture of trust. "You can start by talking to us," he said. Hesitation flitted across the boy's face, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Claire moved closer, carefully guiding him away from the alley's shadows toward the street where the other officers waited. As they walked, Hale kept his tone calm and conversational. He asked about small details, the places he felt safe, the moments that made him run, the people he trusted. Each answer was tentative, cautious, but it built a bridge. By the time they reached the precinct, the boy's posture was less rigid, his eyes more focused. The city outside buzzed on, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place within a small group of people committed to understanding rather than fear. Hale stepped back, observing silently. This was more than a procedural success. It was a test of patience, empathy, and restraint. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't catching someone. It was letting them see that being caught didn't have to mean being broken. The boy, once an unpredictable presence in the city streets, now walked willingly into a space of potential safety and guidance. And Hale realized that the smallest acts of patience could carry the heaviest weight of trust. The boy sat quietly in the interview room, the weight of the past few hours settling on his shoulders. Hale and Claire gave him a moment, letting silence do some of the work words couldn't. Then Hale spoke gently. "You've done something very brave today. Facing your fear, telling the truth, it's not easy." The boy looked up, a flicker of relief in his eyes. Claire handed him a glass of water. "And remember," she added, "this doesn't define you. You have choices ahead, and we're here to help you make the right ones." Slowly, the boy's tense posture softened, the tight knot of worry in his chest beginning to loosen. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not judged, and it made a quiet difference. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the small victory inside the precinct. Hale glanced at Claire, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Sometimes, the hardest battles weren't fought in the streets but within a person's heart. The boy, once a frightened, isolated figure, now had a path forward, supported by those who had chosen understanding over punishment. As they prepared the next steps, counseling, support services, and monitoring the atmosphere was calm but purposeful. Hale knew the work was far from over, yet he felt a quiet satisfaction. Every careful word, every patient gesture, every moment of empathy had built trust, and in that trust lay the possibility of change. The boy stood when the officers approached him, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. His first steps toward a better future were small, hesitant, but entirely his own. Hale and Claire watched him leave the room, and for the first time that day they allowed themselves a brief shared smile. Sometimes the greatest victories were invisible to the world, yet they mattered all the more. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through the windows of the counseling center, spreading a warm, gentle glow across the room. The boy stirred from a restless sleep, his mind still haunted by the memories of the past days, but there was a subtle shift, a fragile sense of relief, a tiny spark of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. Hale and Claire did not enter immediately. They gave him space, understanding that recovery required patience and a quiet environment, free from judgment or pressure. The psychologist's office was calm, almost serene, with shelves of books and soft chairs arranged in a circle. The boy walked in slowly, clutching his notebook, a habit he had developed to capture thoughts he didn't know how to speak aloud. He sat down, hands trembling slightly, but less violently than before. The psychologist greeted him with a gentle smile, her voice soft but steady, like a lifeline thrown across turbulent waters. The session began with small, simple questions. "How did you sleep? How do you feel this morning?" The boy hesitated, biting his lip, eyes darting around as if expecting the shadows of fear to reappear. At first, his answers were short, clipped, almost mechanical. But the psychologist's calm patience created space for trust. Slowly, he began to speak not just about what had happened, but how it had made him feel. Fear, confusion, guilt, and surprisingly, a flicker of determination to survive and move forward. As he spoke, memories that had seemed overwhelming began to lose their power. He spoke about moments of panic on the streets, the weight of the threat that had followed him, and the loneliness that had gnawed at him. Each word released a fragment of tension he had carried alone for so long. The psychologist nodded, never interrupting, offering gentle affirmations, and sometimes letting silence give him the courage to continue. After the session ended, he left the room with a tentative but real smile. His body still bore traces of anxiety, slight trembling, tense shoulders, but inside, something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he realized he wasn't alone. There were people ready to listen, to guide, and to support him without judgment. Outside, Hale and Claire watched quietly, sharing a glance of relief. They understood that justice was not only about the law, it was about compassion, resilience, and the opportunity for someone to start over. Walking down the corridor, the boy noticed small details he hadn't before: the patterned floor, the warm sunlight on the walls, the distant laughter of other children who had found safety here. Each detail, simple and ordinary, felt like a piece of normal life slowly returning to him, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a future, not one dictated by fear, but by choices he could make, slowly, one day at a time. By the time the afternoon light dimmed, the boy sat quietly in the garden outside the center, feeling the cool breeze against his face. He thought about the days ahead, the therapy sessions, the steps of rebuilding trust, the possibility of reconnecting with friends and family. It would not be easy. Healing never was, but for the first time, he believed it was possible. The darkness that had loomed so heavily over him had not vanished entirely, but it had lost its absolute power. In its place, a fragile, growing hope began to take root, a hope he was determined to nurture. Weeks had passed, and the boy's life gradually found a new rhythm. Each morning, he walked into the counseling center with a mix of apprehension and cautious determination, learning to face memories that once paralyzed him. Therapy sessions became more than a routine. They were a safe space where he could slowly untangle the knots of fear and confusion that had wrapped around his mind for months. Each conversation and every small breakthrough felt like a thread stitching together a frayed sense of self, giving him a feeling he had long forgotten: control. Outside the sessions, Hale and Claire remained steady anchors in his life, offering both guidance and emotional support. Claire helped him with practical tasks, at first ordering meals, keeping track of schedules, and learning to trust people's intentions again. Hale, patient and calm, taught him the value of consistency, helping him understand that strength was not about pushing fear away, but about living despite it. Together, they provided stability, reminding him that safety could exist even after trauma. School, once a source of anxiety, slowly became a place of cautious hope. Teachers noticed his focus returning, peers began to interact without fear, and the boy started imagining a life beyond the shadow of past events. He joined a small art club where he could express emotions he found difficult to verbalize. Drawing became a bridge between his inner world and reality, a safe space to process both memories and dreams. He began to understand that the world was not only a place of danger but also full of possibilities. One evening, sitting by his bedroom window, sketching sunlight spilling across a quiet street, he reflected on how far he had come. The fear that had once consumed every thought and action had softened. It was not gone entirely, and perhaps it never would be, but he had learned to move forward anyway. A small, genuine smile crossed his face as he thought of those who had stood by him, the lessons he had learned, and the choices he now had the power to make. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges he could not predict. Yet, he felt a growing determination and a sense that he could face obstacles without being overwhelmed by fear. He understood that healing was a continuous process, not a single moment, and he was ready to take each step, however small. As night fell and stars appeared above, he felt a quiet courage, a fragile but steady belief that tomorrow could hold light, laughter, and the chance to reclaim the life he had almost lost. In that quiet moment, the boy realized something profound. Survival was not merely escaping danger. It was reclaiming his voice, sense of self, and hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt that hope was not a distant dream, but a tangible possibility, waiting for him to embrace it fully. By now, the investigative team had begun to see a pattern, but the audacity and cold calculation behind the crime weighed heavily on everyone's minds. The atmosphere at the Tianjin police station was tense, saturated with a mix of anxiety, determination, and the constant awareness that time was working against them. It was mid-morning in early 2017, the humid sunlight filtering through the small dusty windows, slanting across stacks of case files that testified to long hours of painstaking work. Each file held fragments of truth, yet the detectives knew that connecting these fragments required patience and meticulous attention, because the suspect's next move was unpredictable. Detective Tran Min Chi, head of the homicide unit, leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the collage of witness statements and photographs pinned to the board in front of him. Every scribbled note, every description of a trembling hand or darting gaze was a piece of a complex psychological puzzle. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of sleepless nights and relentless responsibility pressing down. "We are no longer only chasing physical evidence," he said quietly, addressing his team. "We are following behavior, fear, and guilt. Each subtle reaction tells us where the suspect might be and what he is thinking. We need to observe, interpret, and anticipate. Outside the station, life on the river went on as usual. Floating markets moved to the rhythm of early morning trade, and small boats slid silently through narrow canals. Locals went about their business, unaware of the careful, almost surgical pursuit taking place a few blocks away. Yet, for the detectives, every moment counted, and every citizen interaction could offer a clue. Fear left traces hesitation in a voice, a nervous glance, a hand that fidgeted too much, and these traces were sometimes more revealing than fingerprints. The team split into coordinated tasks. One group followed monetary transactions, interviewing merchants who had accepted large bills from nervous youths, noting descriptions with meticulous precision. Another team mapped the suspect's movements through the neighborhoods, observing internet cafes, street vendors, and small shops where the suspect might appear or hide. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, could reveal patterns. A hesitant hand, a repeated glance at the river, a sudden pause when someone passed nearby. These small gestures, when combined, formed a map of fear, guilt, and survival instincts. Detective Chi frequently walked among the canals himself, blending with locals to observe patterns firsthand. He understood the river as more than just a location; it shaped the suspect's behavior. Navigating the floating community required interaction and visibility, constraining the suspect's actions while leaving traces of his fear. Chi's intuition told him that the boy's greatest vulnerability was psychological. Every nervous tick and hesitant step was an unspoken confession. Days passed with tireless interviews and surveillance. Each morning brought leads, yet many dissolved by evening. Despite this, small victories began to emerge. A shopkeeper recalled the suspect's bag slipping, exposing a worn notebook. Another vendor remembered a cautious glance at a patrol officer before handing over money. These fragments, seemingly insignificant, were clues about the suspect's fear, routines, and mindset. One afternoon, a breakthrough emerged almost by chance. A small internet cafe reported a pattern. A young man paying for minimal services with large denomination notes, constantly fidgeting, and frequently looking over his shoulder. The clerk described a thin, pale youth, with eyes wide from a mixture of anxiety and alertness. Chi recognized the same behavioral patterns noted in prior witness accounts: hesitation, vigilance, and subtle self-conscious movements. The suspect's fear was revealing more than he could consciously hide. Surveillance intensified. Detectives observed every interaction, every micro-behavior, every moment of hesitation. Chi knew that while physical evidence was minimal, psychological pressure could corner the suspect more effectively than any search warrant. Each skipped meal, each nervous tick, each repeated glance at the river confirmed the boy's self-imposed restrictions, dictated by guilt and fear. Chi reminded his team that although the suspect had committed serious acts, he was still a child. His decisions, while dangerous, were shaped by inexperience and psychological stress. The detectives used this understanding to anticipate behavior, recognizing that fear and guilt often overrode logic in youths. By mapping movement patterns, behavior triggers, and psychological pressure points, the team began to narrow in on the suspect's most likely locations and reactions. After nearly 4 weeks of painstaking work, the team had detailed the suspect's movements, escape routes, and habits. Maps, witness reports, and observations filled the office walls. Chi gathered his detectives late one evening, speaking quietly but firmly. "We are no longer following shadows. We are tracking consequences. He is young, scared, and trapped by his own choices. Our task is to anticipate his next step before panic dictates it." The detectives worked in near silence, absorbing the gravity of their mission. The boy was not simply a suspect. He was a living study of fear, moral conflict, and the limits of adolescent judgment. As night fell, the floating homes cast long shadows on the river, blending the suspect's movements with the environment, yet also highlighting the careful traces left by his constant anxiety. Chi knew that the final phase of the pursuit required perfect timing and understanding. The team coordinated precise surveillance, anticipating each behavioral reaction. Every ripple of fear, every twitch of the hand, every gaze toward the water or patrol signaled a path forward. Justice, patience, and psychological insight were tools as crucial as any legal authority. By the end of the day, the detectives were confident that they had confined the suspect within a predictable framework. It was no longer chance they understood his limitations, his fears, and his patterns. Somewhere along the canals, under the quiet glow of Tianjiang's street lamps and starlit skies, the boy's own terror was guiding the team toward resolution. The pursuit was approaching its climax, but it was clear that the careful, human understanding of behavior, guilt, and fear would determine the outcome, ultimately bringing closure to a grieving family, and a community that had watched its shadows grow too long for too long. As night deepened over a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Chicago, the dim glow of streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt, creating a ghostly shimmer across empty streets. Detective Michael Tran, a seasoned investigator of 17 years, moved silently through narrow alleys and parking lots, blending with the shadows while calculating every possible move the teenage suspect might make. At 17, the boy was young enough to act unpredictably, yet old enough to recognize danger. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the environment for threats, his hands twitching slightly, and every pause revealed an inner struggle between fear and survival instinct. Michael knew that time was critical. The longer the boy roamed through the suburban maze, the greater the risk of an accident or confrontation. He gathered his team in the back office of a small precinct, maps and digital tablets scattered across the table, showing predicted escape routes, locations of prior sightings, and patterns of hesitation. "We are not just intercepting him physically," Michael said, voice calm but commanding. "We are understanding his mind. Every decision he makes is influenced by fear, guilt, and survival instincts. If we anticipate correctly, we can resolve this without unnecessary risk." The team split into units, each responsible for a specific zone, equipped with radios for silent communication. Patrols moved along alleys, parking garages, and dimly lit streets, invisible to casual observers but effectively containing the boy's possible escape routes. For the suspect, each step was a calculation. Which streets offered safety, who might be watching, and which areas were familiar enough to provide comfort. Panic, however, was limiting his options, causing mistakes that left a trail for the detectives to follow. Hours passed with meticulous observation. Every pause, glance, and interaction with locals was recorded. It became apparent that the boy gravitated toward familiar landmarks: a shuttered convenience store, an abandoned warehouse, and a small park where he had often played as a child. These stops were driven by fear as much as memory places that felt safe enough for him to briefly regain control over his racing thoughts. At approximately 1:15 a.m., a breakthrough came. A night janitor who had seen the boy loitering near a closed parking garage called it in. He described the boy as pale, trembling, and clutching a small backpack. The information reached Michael instantly. The boy's fear was now forcing him back into familiar territory, narrowing his movement options. Detectives silently positioned themselves around the warehouse and the surrounding streets. The night was alive with distant traffic hum and occasional sirens, masking their movements while maintaining full observation. Michael approached the final vantage point, remaining in shadow. From this position, he saw the boy pacing near the edge of the parking lot, fists clenched, eyes scanning constantly. The body language screamed anxiety, shallow breathing, tight shoulders, and sudden stops. Michael spoke softly, deliberately calm, ensuring the tone would resonate without triggering panic. "It's over. You're safe now. We just want to talk." For a tense moment, the boy froze. Fear collided with his desire for self-preservation. The detectives maintained distance, subtly guiding his movement without forcing confrontation. Slowly, he lowered his backpack, tension gradually releasing as rational thought returned. The culmination of weeks of patient surveillance and careful psychological strategy had succeeded. His surrender was mental as well as physical, a recognition that resistance would only bring harm. As he was escorted to the precinct, every move was handled with care to avoid escalation. The humidity of the night mixed with relief, signaling both the end of the pursuit and the preservation of a young life, now guided toward accountability rather than further chaos. Once at the station, he was treated appropriately for his age. Legal processing, psychological assessment, and support aimed at rehabilitation rather than punishment. Michael reflected on the operation, appreciating the role of patience, behavioral analysis, and teamwork. Unlike many conventional pursuits that relied on force, this approach prioritized empathy, observation, and anticipation. The boy, once a shadow moving through parking lots and empty streets, was now the focus of careful attention, a chance at guided correction. The surrounding community, which had been tense and anxious, could begin to breathe easier, knowing the situation was handled with precision and care. By dawn, the city awoke to empty streets glistening under early light. The investigation had concluded not through confrontation, but through strategy, psychological insight, and calm determination. Michael knew this case would be remembered not just for its resolution, but for the example it set: understanding fear, predicting behavior, and applying intellect over brute force. The boy, though still young, had been redirected toward accountability, and the community, reassured by the thoughtful approach, could slowly return to normal life. In Chicago's outskirts, life continued, but beneath the surface, the lessons of observation, patience, and human complexity lingered, subtly shaping future strategies for justice. By mid-morning, the streets of the suburban Chicago neighborhood began to fill with the gentle hum of daily life. Cars cruised along neatly lined roads, joggers traced familiar loops through small parks, and children's laughter echoed faintly from playgrounds bathed in sunlight. Detective Michael Tran walked deliberately along the perimeter of the precinct, reflecting on the events of the previous night. Every decision, every observation had contributed to the peaceful resolution, yet he knew the real work often began afterward. True accountability, rehabilitation, and understanding of human behavior extended far beyond the moment of surrender. Inside the precinct, the boy sat quietly, a mixture of relief and lingering fear etched into his features. Social workers and psychologists had been briefed on the case, ready to engage him in a structured and supportive environment. Michael observed from a short distance as a calm conversation unfolded. Questions were posed carefully, responses encouraged without judgment. The goal was clear: redirect his impulses, build trust, and create a path toward understanding the consequences of his actions. Here, in this controlled environment, the boy was no longer running from shadows. He was confronting the reality of his choices, guided by trained professionals who balanced firmness with empathy. Michael's partner, Officer Karen Lewis, approached with a fresh cup of coffee, her expression a mix of relief and fatigue. "He's responding well," she said quietly, nodding toward the counseling room. "He's scared, but he's starting to open up. That's progress." Michael took a sip, savoring the warmth, feeling the weight of exhaustion mixed with satisfaction. Nights like these tested more than physical stamina. They tested patience, intellect, and the ability to read subtle human cues. He recalled the sequence of movements that had led to the successful interception. Every alley, parking garage, and abandoned warehouse had been mapped and monitored, integrated into a comprehensive strategy. The boy's actions had been predictable when viewed through a psychological lens. Fear guiding movement, familiarity dictating choices, and stress triggering mistakes. By leveraging this understanding, Michael and his team had minimized risk while maintaining control. It was a triumph of preparation, observation, and applied psychology. Outside the precinct, sunlight illuminated the neighborhood, symbolic of a new day, a chance for renewal. The boy, under supervision, was escorted to a waiting vehicle, part of a program designed to return him to a safe environment while ongoing assessments continued. Michael noted the slight tension in his posture, the hesitant steps, the subtle cues indicating a mind still processing fear. Yet, there was also a flicker of understanding, a recognition that the chaos of the previous night had ended, and now the path forward required cooperation and reflection. Throughout the morning, Michael engaged with his team, reviewing the operation, analyzing successes, and identifying areas for improvement. Communication had been seamless, coordination precise, and the psychological approach had proved critical, yet lessons remained. Could they have anticipated the boy's hesitation sooner? Were there early signals overlooked in the initial hours? These questions fueled continuous refinement of strategies, ensuring future cases benefited from accumulated knowledge. In a nearby cafe, a casual observer might have missed the significance of the city's quiet triumph. Conversations buzzed about ordinary topics, baristas moved with practiced efficiency, and commuters scrolled through their phones while sipping coffee. For Michael and his team, however, the knowledge that one young life had been redirected and a potential escalation prevented provided profound satisfaction. Justice, here, was measured not in arrests but in careful orchestration of human understanding and intervention. By midday, reports were filed, digital logs updated, and follow-up plans initiated. The boy would enter a structured program combining counseling, education, and supervised community engagement. Michael reflected on the importance of such programs not as punitive measures but as vehicles for rehabilitation. Adolescents, facing high-stress situations, required guidance, not only legally but emotionally and cognitively, to navigate life responsibly. Walking back to his car, Michael considered the broader implications. Law enforcement, often perceived as reactive, could shape outcomes proactively when combined with insight and strategy. The night's success demonstrated the value of patience, anticipation, and psychological acumen. Behind every report, call, and operation, there were human beings complex, flawed, yet capable of change when approached thoughtfully. Later, in a community debriefing, Michael emphasized awareness and collaboration. Parents, educators, and local authorities all played roles in preventing escalation and fostering safe environments. The narrative of the boy's night-long flight through the suburbs was one of potential realized through careful, compassionate intervention. Each participant, from patrol officers to counselors, had contributed to a resolution balancing accountability with care. As evening approached, suburban streets returned to a comforting rhythm. Streetlights flickered on, and the soft hum of traffic filled the air. Michael paused at a quiet corner, observing the neighborhood bathed in gentle light, reflecting on the layers of human experience that had unfolded. He understood that success in law enforcement was measured not merely by case closure, but by quality of resolution, the preservation of life, the guidance of those at risk, and the thoughtful orchestration of each decision toward outcomes that were just humane and constructive. By nightfall, the city had settled into quiet normalcy once more. Michael returned home, carrying fatigue mixed with fulfillment. The boy's story, though incomplete, had taken a turn toward possibility. The streets, warehouses, and alleys of the previous night now stood empty, silent witnesses to a carefully executed strategy, a testament to observation, intellect, and human understanding. Vigilance tempered with empathy, strategy informed by psychology, and patience combined with experience had transformed potentially destructive moments into opportunities for growth, reflection, and meaningful change. As the suburban skyline darkened, Michael allowed himself a rare moment of rest, confident that the night's careful orchestration had not only resolved a crisis, but contributed to a broader vision of justice, one where human behavior, understanding, and opportunity intertwined to create outcomes far more powerful than simple enforcement. In Chicago's quiet outskirts, life continued, layered with lessons of observation, anticipation, and the quiet triumph of guiding someone toward a better path. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Chicago precinct, casting long golden rays across the busy hallways. Detective Michael Tran arrived earlier than usual, driven by an ingrained sense of responsibility that had never allowed him to fully rest after high-stakes situations. The streets outside were relatively quiet, the early commuters moving steadily, creating a calm backdrop for what promised to be a demanding day. Michael's mind was already at work, analyzing the events of the past few days, noting each action, each decision, and considering the lessons they provided. Inside the briefing room, the team gathered quietly. Files, surveillance footage, and psychological reports were spread across the table. Every detail mattered, no matter how minor, and Michael encouraged his colleagues to review each observation carefully. Officer Karen Lewis highlighted subtle behavioral cues in the boy's actions that had revealed hesitation and fear clues that had helped ensure everyone's safety. Michael acknowledged her points, appreciating how psychological insight had made a tangible difference in the outcome. Updates from social workers painted a cautiously optimistic picture. The boy, only 14, was responding positively to structured guidance, showing glimpses of self-awareness and reflection. Michael considered how trauma, environment, and emotional maturity intersected, shaping the choices of a young mind under pressure. His experience reminded him that law enforcement was not solely about rules and authority, it was about empathy, guidance, and creating opportunities for growth. After the briefing, Michael walked through the precinct, observing the routine operations, officers typing reports, citizens attending appointments, phones ringing with inquiries. The contrast between normal operations and crisis situations reminded him how crucial careful attention and measured responses were in everyday policing. Every interaction, even seemingly mundane, carried the potential to influence someone's trajectory. Later that morning, he visited the boys' temporary care facility. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the floor. The boy participated in structured activities led by trained counselors, approaching each task with cautious curiosity. Michael observed silently, noting posture, gestures, and expressions, subtle indicators of fear, hesitation, or growing confidence. His mind weighed the delicate balance between intervention and autonomy, knowing that the smallest encouragement or correction could significantly impact the boy's development. Michael also reflected on the larger societal context. Access to education, mental health services, and community support were essential factors influencing behavior and outcomes. Recognizing gaps and advocating for improvements became a personal commitment. He understood that long-term success relied on a network of professionals and engaged community members, not law enforcement alone. By midday, Michael returned to the precinct to finalize the boys' care plan with the juvenile program team. Counseling sessions, educational modules, and supervised community involvement were scheduled to instill responsibility, reflection, and empathy. Michael reviewed each component carefully, ensuring they adhered to best practices and legal guidelines. The details were exhaustive, but precision was essential to maintain the progress achieved. As afternoon settled, Michael briefly stepped outside. Children played along the sidewalks, sunlight reflected off nearby buildings, and traffic moved steadily. It was a visual reminder of life's continuity, how each day progressed, regardless of past events. Back inside, debriefings continued, emphasizing learning, communication, and thoughtful intervention. Success was measured not in arrests or punishment, but in the ability to guide young lives safely toward growth and opportunity. By evening, Michael left the precinct. Streetlights flickered on, casting warm amber glows over the quieting city streets. Reflecting on the boy's journey, the careful operation, and the collaboration between law enforcement and social services, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. His work had not only prevented harm, but had also opened a path for learning and resilience. At home, he looked at the city skyline, a patchwork of lights and stories, each representing challenges and triumphs. Michael's reflection reinforced a vital truth. Effective policing combined observation, strategy, empathy, and guidance. Every life influenced, every careful decision made, contributed to a cycle of constructive change that strengthened both individuals and the community. The evening air in Chicago was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier that afternoon. Detective Michael Tran walked through the streets with a steady, purposeful pace, taking in the quiet hum of the city. Streetlights reflected off the damp pavement, casting long shadows that flickered with each passing car. He carried the weight of responsibility silently, knowing that each decision made today could ripple through lives in unexpected ways. At his apartment, he removed his coat and set it carefully on a chair. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeted him, grounding him after hours on the streets. He poured a cup and sat by the window, watching the city skyline glitter against the darkening sky. Each lit window represented countless stories, people navigating their lives, some facing challenges he could only imagine. It reminded him why his work mattered. Behind statistics and case files were real human lives, fragile and complex. Michael checked messages from the precinct. Minor incidents had been reported, each requiring coordination, but nothing urgent. He responded with concise, methodical clarity, making notes for follow-up in the morning. Even during brief downtime, his mind mapped out strategies for ongoing cases, emphasizing the importance of foresight. A single missed detail could escalate into serious consequences if ignored. Turning his attention to the juvenile program, Michael reviewed the boys' progress. The notes were detailed psychological assessments, behavioral observations, counseling updates, and he cross-referenced them with community resources. He made adjustments to intervention plans, ensuring the approaches were structured yet empathetic. He believed that the combination of careful guidance, consistency, and patience was far more effective than authority alone. Later, he reflected on lessons from previous cases, analyzing what had worked and what needed improvement. He documented his observations, considering both short-term actions and long-term implications. Michael was aware that effective law enforcement extended beyond immediate results. It required understanding systemic patterns, resource distribution, and community dynamics. Around 10 o'clock, he reviewed public alerts and notifications. Minor disturbances, routine patrol updates, and neighborhood watch reports populated his screen. He highlighted items for morning follow-up, preventing any issues from compounding and maintaining public trust. This attention to detail reinforced his belief in structured, proactive policing rather than reactive measures. Michael thought about the boy again, recalling the initial fear and hesitation in his eyes. Each small achievement, every tentative step toward trust, was a testament to patience and persistence. He recognized that his role was not simply to enforce rules, but to foster guidance and understanding, shaping a safer path for those who needed it most. By midnight, he allowed himself a short rest. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren. Sleep came gradually, with his mind reviewing the day's events, mentally planning for the hours to come. Even in rest, his dedication remained a constant undercurrent driving his actions. The following morning, muted sunlight filtered through clouds. Michael resumed his routine, checking overnight reports, coordinating with colleagues, and preparing for the day's responsibilities. The balance between operational efficiency and human-centered strategies guided every decision. Each case demanded flexibility, empathy, and attention to detail. By mid-morning, he returned to the juvenile facility. The boy showed measurable progress, engaging in structured activities, demonstrating self-reflection, and interacting more openly with counselors. Michael observed carefully, noting cues for further guidance. Discussions with counselors refined intervention plans, ensuring alignment with both developmental best practices and safety protocols. Throughout the day, Michael alternated between field coordination, case analysis, and mentoring his team. He emphasized collaboration, critical thinking, and strategic foresight. Younger officers were encouraged to approach situations analytically, considering immediate consequences and long-term impact. Michael's leadership fostered a culture where empathy and strategic planning were valued equally alongside enforcement. By late afternoon, the city's rhythm shifted. Residents returned home, streets grew quieter, and streetlights illuminated intersections. Michael reflected on the sacrifices inherent to his profession, yet also acknowledged the profound satisfaction derived from seeing positive change. Guiding young individuals toward safety and opportunity, and contributing to community well-being provided motivation beyond duty. In the quiet of his apartment, Michael reviewed the day's work one last time. Notes, observations, and schedules were meticulously organized, ensuring readiness for tomorrow's challenges. He paused to gaze at the city lights, appreciating the subtle progress of the boy, the dedication of his team, and the resilience of the community. Each decision, each act of guidance, contributed to a slow but meaningful cycle of change. As midnight approached, Michael prepared for rest, confident that he had acted with diligence, foresight, and empathy. Tomorrow would present new challenges, yet he was ready, observant, thoughtful, and resolute, blending the demands of law enforcement with compassion and strategy, committed to the growth and safety of the lives he touched.